Imagine you have been walking every single day for the past 3 months. You set the alarm, you lace up your shoes, you do the 30-minute loop around the neighborhood, and you feel good about it because everyone says walking is enough. Walking is what your body needs. Walking is the foundation. And then you sit down one afternoon and your legs feel exactly the same as they did in January. The same weakness going up the stairs, the same fatigue after standing too long, the same nagging feeling that your lower body is not doing what it should be doing. Here is what nobody told you. Walking is not training. Walking is movement, and there is one exercise, a single movement that does not require a gym, does not require equipment, and does not require more than 15 minutes, that produces more measurable strength and muscular adaptation in your legs than walking ever will. The science behind why this works is genuinely remarkable, and once you understand it, you will never think about leg training the same way again. If you have ever felt frustrated that regular movement is not changing how your legs feel or perform, stay with this until the end, because the mechanism I am going to explain changes everything about how you approach it. And if this kind of content helps you, the most useful thing you can do right now is subscribe, because that is how more people find it. Let me start with something that most fitness content will never say directly. Walking is valuable. Walking reduces cardiovascular risk, it supports metabolic health, it improves mood through mechanisms we will get to in a moment, and it is something almost every adult can do, regardless of fitness level or age. None of that is in dispute. But walking does not build leg strength in any meaningful, progressive way. And the reason comes down to a concept in exercise physiology called the principle of progressive overload, which is the foundational rule that governs how muscle tissue actually changes. Your muscles do not adapt to effort that is comfortable. They adapt to effort that exceeds what they have already handled. When a stimulus is new, when it demands more from the tissue than the tissue has experienced before, the body initiates a repair and rebuilding process. Microscopic damage occurs in the muscle fibers during exertion. Satellite cells rush in to repair that damage, and when the repair is complete, the tissue is slightly thicker, slightly denser, slightly more capable than it was before. That is how muscle grows. That is how legs get stronger. Walking, for most adults over the age of 30, does not come close to crossing that threshold. It is too familiar. The load is too low. The neuromuscular demand is too predictable. Your legs have been walking since you were 13 months old. There is no adaptation signal there. It is maintenance at best. Now this matters enormously, for a reason that goes far beyond aesthetics or athletic performance, and I want to spend real time on it, because I think most people have never heard this framed in a way that actually lands. Your legs are home to approximately 60% of your total skeletal muscle mass. The quadriceps, the hamstrings, the glutes, the calves, and the smaller stabilizing muscles of the hip and knee collectively represent the single largest muscular system in the human body. And skeletal muscle is not a passive tissue. It is metabolically active tissue that performs functions your long-term health absolutely depends on. Muscle tissue is the primary site of glucose disposal after a meal. When you eat carbohydrates and blood glucose rises, roughly 70 to 80% of that glucose is taken up by skeletal muscle in the hours following the meal. This process is driven by insulin, and the efficiency of that process depends directly on how much functional muscle mass you have and how metabolically active it is. Researchers like Dr. Naveed Sattar at the University of Glasgow have published extensively on the relationship between lower limb muscle mass, insulin sensitivity, and type 2 diabetes risk. The data consistently shows that people with greater leg muscle mass have better glucose regulation, lower fasting insulin, and substantially reduced risk of developing metabolic disease. This is not a secondary finding. This is a central mechanism. Your leg muscles are a metabolic engine, and if that engine is not being trained, it is slowly becoming less efficient. Beyond glucose metabolism, skeletal muscle functions as what researchers now call a secretory organ. When muscle tissue contracts, particularly under load, it releases signaling molecules called myokines into the bloodstream. Interleukin-6 released from contracting muscle tissue has anti-inflammatory effects when it comes from exercise, as opposed to the pro-inflammatory effects it has in other contexts. Irisin, a myokine studied extensively by Dr. Pontus Bostrom and colleagues at Harvard Medical School, has been shown to cross the blood-brain barrier and promote the growth of new neurons in the hippocampus, the brain region most critical for memory and learning. Your legs, when they are working hard, are talking to your brain. That connection is not metaphorical, it is biochemical. And walking does not generate enough mechanical load to trigger meaningful myokine release. The signal is too quiet, so we need something louder. The exercise is the squat, not the barbell squat performed in a gym under 200 pounds of external load. The bodyweight squat, done correctly, done consistently, done with intention, is the single most effective tool for building lower body strength that an adult without equipment can use. And I want to explain exactly why it produces results that walking cannot, because the mechanism is specific and the mechanism is what makes it work. When you lower your body into a squat, several things happen simultaneously in your muscular system. The quadriceps, which are the four muscles running across the front of your thigh, are performing an eccentric contraction, which means they are lengthening under tension to control your descent. Eccentric contractions are significantly more damaging to muscle fiber at the microstructural level than concentric contractions, which is why they produce a stronger adaptation signal. The glutes are loaded in a lengthened position at the bottom of the squat in a way that walking never replicates. Walking loads glutes briefly and partially during the push-off phase of gait. A squat holds the glutes under full tension in a mechanically stretched position for the duration of the descent and the initial drive upward. The hamstrings are co-contracting to stabilize the knee. The calves are managing the ankle joint. The erector spinae and the transverse abdominis are working to keep the spine in a neutral position. Every major muscle group in the lower body is being recruited simultaneously in a coordinated pattern, and the load on all of them is your own body weight, which for the average American adult represents somewhere between 140 and 220 pounds of resistance applied through a full range of motion. That is not trivial resistance. For someone who has never trained squats, that is more than enough to cross the threshold of progressive overload and initiate genuine muscular adaptation. Research published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research has demonstrated that bodyweight squats performed to fatigue produce measurable increases in quadriceps cross-sectional area, as measured by ultrasound imaging, in previously untrained adults over periods as short as 8 weeks. A study by Calatayud and colleagues compared bodyweight squats to loaded machine squats in terms of neuromuscular activation using electromyography, and found that when bodyweight squats were performed at high effort levels, the muscular activation patterns were comparable to machine-loaded variations for the primary movers. The neuromuscular demand is real. The signal is genuine. Your body does not know whether you are in a gym or your living room. It only knows whether the demand on the tissue crossed the adaptation threshold or not. If you are finding this useful, and you want more content that goes this deep on the actual science of how your body adapts, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is the kind of thing we explore regularly on this channel. There is a lot more ground to cover here, so keep watching. Now I want to go a layer deeper, because there is a dimension of squat training that does not get talked about nearly enough in mainstream fitness content, and it explains a lot of the real-world benefits that people report beyond just physical strength. That dimension is neuromuscular efficiency. Your muscles do not work in isolation. Every movement you make is the result of a conversation between your nervous system and your muscle tissue. Motor neurons in your spinal cord send electrical signals to muscle fibers, and those fibers contract in response. The number of fibers recruited in a given contraction and the speed at which those motor units fire determines how much force your muscle can produce. One of the primary ways that strength training improves performance is not by immediately adding new muscle protein, but by improving the nervous system's ability to recruit more fibers more quickly. This is called neural adaptation, and it is the reason people often notice strength improvements in the first few weeks of training before any visible change in muscle size has occurred. The nervous system is learning. It is becoming more efficient at sending the signal and getting a response. Bodyweight squats, particularly when performed with attention to depth and tempo, place significant demands on balance, proprioception, and motor coordination. Proprioception is your body's ability to sense the position of your joints in space without looking at them. It comes from sensory receptors in your muscles, tendons, and joint capsules called mechanoreceptors. And it is what allows you to walk in the dark without falling, to catch yourself when you trip, to adjust your balance automatically when the ground changes. As people age, proprioceptive sensitivity declines. The mechanoreceptors become less responsive. The time it takes for the nervous system to receive a balance disruption signal and issue a correction becomes longer. This is a primary contributor to fall risk in adults over 60, and falls in that population are a leading cause of injury, hospitalization, and loss of independence. Research from the Journal of Aging and Physical Activity has shown that squat training in older adults produces measurable improvements in proprioceptive sensitivity and dynamic balance, reducing fall incidence in intervention groups compared to controls. This is not a minor quality of life issue. For a 60-year-old adult, the ability to maintain balance and lower body strength is directly correlated with the ability to live independently, to climb stairs, to get up from the floor, to carry groceries, to function. And walking, as valuable as it is, does not challenge proprioception in the same systematic way that squatting does, because squatting involves a direction of movement which is vertical, and a joint angle which is deep hip and knee flexion, that walking simply does not reach. Here is where it gets even more interesting. Resistance exercise, including bodyweight squats performed at sufficient intensity, triggers a hormonal response that aerobic activity like walking does not produce at comparable magnitude. Within minutes of beginning a challenging set of squats, your body begins releasing growth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. Growth hormone does not only build muscle, it mobilizes stored fat for energy, it supports tissue repair throughout the body, it stimulates the liver to produce insulin-like growth factor 1, which is a key driver of muscle protein synthesis. Dr. William Kramer at the University of Connecticut has published decades of research on the hormonal responses to resistance exercise, and his data consistently shows that compound lower body exercises performed at high intensity produce greater acute growth hormone release than upper body exercises or aerobic activities matched for duration. The reason is partly mechanical. The larger the muscle mass involved in the exercise, the greater the metabolic disruption, and the greater the metabolic disruption, the stronger the hormonal signaling. Squats recruit more total muscle mass than almost any other single movement. The hormonal environment after a challenging set of squats is fundamentally different from the hormonal environment after a 30-minute walk. And that hormonal environment matters for more than just your legs. Testosterone, which plays a role in muscle maintenance in both men and women, also shows acute increases following heavy lower body resistance exercise. Cortisol rises as well, which is expected as part of the stress response, but the ratio of anabolic to catabolic hormones after resistance training is tilted toward building and repair in a way that aerobic training does not replicate at moderate intensities. None of this means walking has no hormonal benefit. Walking reduces cortisol over time, improves insulin sensitivity, and supports circadian rhythm regulation. But walking not generating the acute anabolic signal that squatting is. And for the specific goal of building leg strength, that signal is exactly what you need. I want to spend time on execution because the squat is a movement that most adults perform incorrectly, and performing it incorrectly limits results while increasing the risk of discomfort in the knees and lower back. Neither of those outcomes is acceptable when we are talking about a free, accessible exercise that you should be able to do for the rest of your life. The starting position matters. Stand with your feet roughly shoulder-width apart, toes angled, slightly outward, somewhere between 5 and 20 degrees depending on your hip anatomy. Your weight should be distributed evenly across the entire foot, not just the heels, not just the toes. The descent begins by hinging simultaneously at the hip and the knee. This is the part most people get wrong. They initiate the squat by bending the knee first, which shifts the load forward, increases shear force at the knee joint, and reduces glute activation. The correct movement begins with a simultaneous hip send, meaning your hips move back and down at the same time your knees track forward over the toes. Your chest stays up. Your lower back maintains a neutral curve, not an exaggerated arch and not a rounded spine. You go as deep as your mobility allows, ideally until your thighs are parallel to the floor or below, because deeper squat depths produce greater glute and hamstring activation than partial squats. Research from Kubo and colleagues, published in the European Journal of Applied Physiology, demonstrated that squat training through full range of motion produced significantly greater increases in muscle volume and tendon stiffness, compared to half squats performed with the same external load. Depth is not optional for optimal adaptation. It is mechanical. On the way up, you drive through the entire foot, press the knees out to track over the toes, and squeeze the glutes at the top of the movement. Breathing matters here as well. Inhale as you descend, exhale as you drive up. For most adults beginning squat training, 2 to 3 sets of 10 to 20 repetitions, done 3 to 4 times per week, represents a starting point that crosses the adaptation threshold without creating excessive soreness or recovery demand. The key word in that sentence is progression. As the movement becomes easier, as the current volume stops creating any sensation of muscular fatigue, the dose must increase. More repetitions, more sets, slower tempo, a pause at the bottom, or eventually added resistance in the form of a loaded backpack or dumbbells held at the sides. Progressive overload is the mechanism, and you have to keep feeding it. Let me now bring this to a frame that I think is the most important one, especially for adults between 35 and 65 who are thinking about what movement looks like, not just this year, but over the next several decades. There is a concept in gerontology research called the muscle mass threshold, which refers to the minimum level of lean muscle mass below which functional independence becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Sarcopenia, which is the age-related loss of muscle mass and function, begins as early as the mid-30s in people who are not training against it, and it accelerates after 60. Estimates suggest that adults lose approximately 3 to 8% of muscle mass per decade after 30 if they are not engaging in resistance training, and that rate increases substantially after 60. Dr. Roger Fielding at Tufts University has published extensively on sarcopenia and its consequences, showing that the loss of lower body muscle mass specifically is one of the strongest predictors of mobility limitation, fall risk, and loss of independence in aging adults. Walking does not stop sarcopenia. It can slow the rate of loss somewhat because any movement is better than no movement. But it does not provide the mechanical stimulus required to maintain or rebuild muscle mass. Resistance exercise does. And the squat, which loads the largest muscles in the body through a functional movement pattern, which means a movement that mirrors the demands of daily life like sitting, standing, and climbing, is the most practical and accessible form of resistance training for the lower body that most adults can perform. The connection between lower body strength and longevity is no longer speculative. A 2018 study published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, analyzing data from over 80,000 adults, found that muscle strengthening activities performed 2 or more times per week were associated with a 23% lower risk of all-cause mortality and a 31% lower risk of cancer-related mortality. The effect was independent of aerobic exercise. The people doing resistance training had better outcomes than people doing only cardio. Your legs are not just transportation, they are a longevity organ. And here is the part that I think is genuinely extraordinary when you let it sink in. The body does not care how old you are when you start. Longitudinal research from the Journal of Gerontology has shown that adults in their 70s and 80s who begin resistance training programs still produce measurable increases in muscle cross-sectional area, improvements in lower body strength, and gains in functional mobility within 8 to 12 weeks of consistent training. The adaptation capacity does not disappear with age. It slows, but it is still there. Your muscle tissue, no matter what decade you are in, still responds to a sufficient stimulus. The window has not closed. It is simply waiting for you to give it a reason to open. Here is where everything lands. You have been walking, and walking is good, and you should keep walking. But if you have been waiting for your legs to feel stronger, to perform better, to carry you through the next 30 years without becoming a liability, walking alone is not the answer, and it was never going to be the answer. The squat is the answer. It is not glamorous. It requires no membership, no equipment, no commute, and no special clothing. It requires about 15 minutes, and the willingness to go deep enough that you feel it. Start with 2 sets of 15 repetitions, 3 times this week, not next week, this week. Pay attention to how your legs feel 24 hours later. That soreness, that delayed onset muscle soreness, which typically peaks at 24 to 48 hours after the session, is not a warning sign. It is a confirmation signal. It means the tissue received a stimulus it had not experienced before. It means adaptation is beginning. 3 weeks of consistent squatting will produce changes in leg strength and muscular endurance that 3 months of daily walking could not. The science behind that statement is what we covered today, and understanding the mechanism is what makes it stick. If this gave you something useful, share it with someone who has been telling themselves that their daily walk is enough. Not to discourage them from walking, but because they deserve to know that there is one more thing they can add, one simple movement that changes the equation entirely. Subscribe to Smart Psychology if you want more content that goes this deep, because there is a lot more of this coming, and you do not want to miss it.